Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel, and if it's the first time you've popped along to the channel, well, you've picked a spectacular day to do so because, well, it's A to ZX of the spectrum, and not only that, we're on to the letter H. That's correct, 8 whole episodes into this series and you're about to experience yet another selection of 8-bit masterpieces. You think you're up for it? Then just wait until after the titles. So first up for the letter H, we're going to have Jarrell Software's 1983 game, Harrier Attack. Now Harrier Attack, as you can see, well, it's a side-scrolling shooter, but a side-scrolling shooter with a difference, because back in the day, most side-scrolling shooters, well, they were all about space. This one, however, not so much. This one, of course, is set in terra firma, good old Earth itself, and sees you as the pilot of a Harrier jump jet fighter performing a bombing run over a hostile enemy island. Now, what made this game so frustrating and also so addictive was the fact that it was a one-hit, one-death game. That's correct, you have absolutely no lives, and if one of the enemy aircraft were to hit you with their missile, well, you're dead. If you were to crash into the landscape, well, dead. And of course, if you ran into too much flak, which you can see from the gameplay is displayed as, you know, those purple splashes, well, you were dead. And once you were dead, well, you were back to the beginning of the mission and you had to start again. Now, as I said, this was 1983, and for 1983 it was pretty much outstanding, especially on a home microcomputer. And back then, of course, high score games were the mainstay of the market. Games that you could have a quick run through of, get the highest score you could, and then try to beat it, or of course, have one of your friends or family try to beat it. And Harrier Attack for me was one of the finest examples of this, which was why me and my buddies back in the day used to sit and play this for hours at a time, taking turns to try and beat each other's high scores as we took on the island assault. And of course, anyone with any sort of knowledge of video games at the time will notice that, well, it's very Defender-like in style, with the exception that, well, you're blowing up the stuff on the ground and not trying to save it. But if you do like addictive high-score run games, well, this was definitely one to play, and one you should even play today. Next up we have Hunch Back, published by Ocean Software in 1983, so yes, another early game. Now, I would like to say platformer, but there's no platforms as such. It's more of a side-scrolling run, jump and puzzler. Now, I'm not sure if that's a genre in itself, but this is certainly the best description for Hunchback. And this was a style that was very prevalent back in the home micro market. Games, of course, that never had so much of a story, but multiple levels of differing challenge that would force you to play time and time again just to get one more stage further. And like most games from the era, well, this was tough as old boots. Whether you were jumping the flaming barrels or trying to jump onto a rope or even jump over the soldiers who were guarding the ramparts, well, each jump had to be pixel perfect. Now fortunately, of course, you had multiple lives in this game, because of course, like all games back in the day, there was no such thing as a save point. You couldn't get 3 or 4 levels in, throw in a cheeky save, and if you did die you could go back to that save point. No, whenever you lost all 3 lives, well, you were back to the beginning. And in Hunchback there was so many different ways to die, either from the obstacles that you were facing or the time limit, which you might notice the guard climbing up the wall, who will eventually get to the top, chase after you and kill you if you haven't made it to the bell in time. And like I've said before, people go on and on about how tough the Souls-like games are, but back in the day, every game was like this. But the joy that you experienced every time you beat a level that maybe had you stuck for 10 or 20 lives, well, there was no comparison for that feeling. So if you like your games brutal, well, go back and play some Hunchback, because this game definitely gives the Souls-likes a run for their money. Third up for the letter H, we have Drivin, published by Domar in 1989. So yes, a later ZX Spectrum game, and not only a ZX Spectrum game, but of course a port from an arcade game. And first up, I would like to give the developers the proper respect for at least trying to port what was one of the most demanding 3D arcade games at the time onto a ZX Spectrum, because it shouldn't even have been remotely possible. And to say that it was pushing the abilities of the ZX Spectrum, well, that's a complete understatement, because as you can see from the gameplay footage, it looked like they managed to get out a whopping 1 frame per second on an almost monochromatic rendition of the game. Now, I truly did love this game in the arcades. It was a very tough game. It wasn't one for the faint of heart. It was a driving simulator, or at least what they could put out as a driving simulator at the time. The arcade cab had, of course, a steering wheel, pedals and a gear stick. Now, none of these things were available for the ZX Spectrum, certainly not at the time anyway. So what the developers managed to do was, well, make left and right, not just turn left and right. Now, if you notice the 2 blue arrows on the dashboard and the green bar beneath, well, that's the position your steering wheel's in, and what you had to do was turn left to turn that towards the left, or right to turn it towards the right. But of course that meant if the indication bar was turned all the way to the left, your steering wheel was in essence turned all the way to the left. So you would keep turning left, and just merely by pressing right, well, all you would be doing would be pulling that indication bar back round to the right, and slowly you'd begin to straighten up and then turn right. To say the controls were finicky, well, that would be a complete understatement as well. Just sometimes managing to maintain a straight line in this game was near impossible, and on top of that you had to regulate the speed to either take the corners, or if you were brave enough, turn down one of the stunt roads and attempt either a ramp or even the infamous loop. Now, even in the arcade with the steering wheel, the pedals and gear stick, this game was incredibly difficult to not only just pull off from a development point of view, but to play as a player's point of view. So on the Spectrum, with the limited processing power and of course no real peripherals to actually control the car the way it was intended to be played, well, it was darn near impossible. But of course it was, however, a version of hard driving that you could play at home, so of course I wanted it. And once you had it, if you could put in maybe the 300 or 400 hours of play that you needed to get proficient at the game, well, you could almost eventually drive around the course. But of course I believe this was more of a vanity piece for the developers, something that they wanted to prove that they could at least try to attempt, rather than put out a game that was suitable to the platform that actually wouldn't feel broken in gameplay. But yes, it was a good attempt, and it was a very tough thing for them to try and replicate. But I wouldn't recommend under any circumstances anyone who has no nostalgia for this game at all to even attempt playing the ZX Spectrum version. Game number 4 in the letter H today, we're going to have Kong Phooey. Now, anyone from back in the day will remember Kong Phooey very fondly indeed. It was a wonderful cartoon, and when he came to the ZX Spectrum in video game form, we got the typical tough platform game that we all expected from the era, especially in licensed games. Now, this game of course came out in 1990, so it was a very late Spectrum game, and you can tell from the graphics alone this was a late era game. The Kong Phooey sprite is well defined and beautifully animated. And the gameplay itself, well, it's nothing less than solid. Rather than having 3 lives, which was a fairly popular trait on platformers, you had a health bar, which in this game was represented as the Hong Kong Book of Kung Fu. Now, there was multiple ways to take damage. There was spikes in the floor and ceiling, there was drop damage, and of course enemy sprites who would get in your way, either by physical attack, and some of them even had guns to shoot at you. Our good old chum Kong Phooey, however, well, he had the power of Kung Fu on his side, giving him the ability to punch and kick his way through all the enemy sprites while he tried to open the doors and sometimes collect some health potions just to get to the end of the next level. Now, unlike hard driving, this is a game that I would fully recommend anyone picking up if they were interested in playing some older ZX Spectrum games. And why? Because, well, it is late in the cycle, and 2, it's a well loved license. And finally, of course, it's a decent game with solid gameplay, and it won't cause the frustration that, well, a lot of the games back then did manage to draw out of us gamers back in the day. For the last game in H, well, I'm going to cheat a bit because I'm not going to be talking about one game, I'm going to be talking about 3 games. And the reason I'm going to be talking about 3 games as well, I'm going to be talking about Horace. And the reason Horace deserves 3 games, well, he was one of the very first video game mascots. Now from my memory alone, Pac-Man was probably the first and only true mascot of the time back in 1980 when he was released. But in 1982, the ZX Spectrum and other home micros of course, received the gift of Horace. His first game in 1982 was Hungry Horace. This is a game I've talked about several times in the channel, so I won't go into too much detail. It's a maze chase. It was basically an evolution of Pac-Man, a game where Horace was chased around the park while he apparently ate all the flowers, trying to avoid the park keepers, picking up any pieces of fruit that the park keepers left behind, and move from maze to maze. And there were only 4 different mazes, and quite frankly some of the mazes weren't what you would call mazes but almost a straight run chase. And of course that old chestnut, it was a high score game. There was no end game, it was just a case of seeing how high a score you could get and compete against your friends and family. Horace's second outing, also in 1982, was Horace Goes Skiing. Now Horace Goes Skiing was, well, it was 2 games in one. The first part was, well, it was a Frogger clone, because Horace, he had to get across a busy highway to get to the ski rental place before he could actually ski. Now if you did manage to get your skis, you were onto the piste, and it was just a simple game of skiing. You would navigate your way down the slalom, avoiding trees, trying to get in between the flags, and again, scoring as many points as you could. One of the unique parts about Horace Goes Skiing, however, was it wasn't lives that you had cash. And every time you were hit by a car or broke your skis, well, you either had to pay an ambulance fee or rent new skis, each thing costing money, and when you ran out of money, well, you ran out of lives. Now the third game in the Horace trilogy, or at least the canon Horace trilogy, was Horace and the Spiders, and this was a game of 3 parts. In the first part you were simply running across the surface and jumping over the spiders that got in your way. And you were doing this simply to get to the next stage of the game, which was a spider cave. And in this spider cave, well, they dropped down webbing, which you had to jump onto and swing from web to web to get to the other side of the cavern. And finally in the third part, you were in the spider's web itself, and what you had to do in the spider's web was to create holes in the spider's web, because in doing this the spider would fall into the hole and you would have the opportunity then to go on top of the spider, jump on it several times until it fell to its death. You had to repeat this for each spider in the level, and after you'd completed this you would go back to the beginning level and repeat. And of course again, it was a high score game. You played it as long as you possibly could, and instead of having lives in Horace and the Spiders, well, you had vials of serum, and if you ran out of your serum, if the spiders caught you, you died. So there was Horace, one of the very earliest video game mascots of all time. And these 3 games are absolutely must plays if you do own a ZX Spectrum, or if you're at all interested in playing games from that era, because he truly is a part of video game history. So there you have it, my friends, another selection of 8-bit classics from the ZX Spectrum era. So if you want to talk about any of these games, then just drop down in the comments and I will get back to you. And it doesn't matter whether you want to tell me that you've played these games, that you've never played these games, or maybe perhaps these games have inspired you to comment something else. For example, Backpack Comics, a young man from LA, well, he commented last week that he had no idea how many modern games have their roots back in the 80s. Well, quite frankly, most of them do. So if you've got anything that you want to share with me, drop it down in the comments. I'll even respond to Commodore kids, because we all know the Spectrum was best, but some poor souls out there only had a Commodore 64. Anyway, joking aside, if you've enjoyed this content, then please throw me a thumbs up, because 1, it makes a difference to the channel, and 2, it makes a difference to me, because, well, I like to know that you guys enjoy this silly little content that I put out every now and again. And if you want to see more, well, the subscription button is always there for you, and it's always free. So thank you again for watching, and until next time, cheerio!